Hello, I'm Ebony McKenna and welcome to Working with Scene Cards webinar part 2. If this is the first one you're watching, please go back and watch part 1. It will make so much more sense. So on we go to part 2. Now, these are our 13 romantic moment structure cards that will help us create a nice balanced romantic story. Now, I keep saying romantic because romance has a happy ever after. If your book does not have a happy ever after, or even a hopefully ever after, or perhaps a hopefully for now, it's probably not a romance. It will have romantic elements. That's terrific. Anyway, this is a 3-act model that I'm basing it on. And this is a wonderful thing to cut out and keep to help keep track of what goes where. So let's move on to card number 2. In part 1 we talked about card number 7, card number 1 and card number 13. We are going back to card number 2 now. This is called the disturbance. In these several scenes, because it's not just one scene, you could have a few scenes, this is where something comes along to disturb your heroine's current world. Okay, something comes along to upset her apple cart, if I can cliche it that way. This will be a reactive scene. There will be some plotting and planning on behalf of your heroine, so she needs to say or think, this can't be right, I can't put up with this. Now there's also this is where some of her deeply held beliefs start to come into play. We don't go too much into backstory yet, but we'll see some of her beliefs play out a bit, and we might learn about how she came to those beliefs later. There's also a note there called stasis equals death. I'll get onto that in a moment. But first, everyone says make the reader care. So there's 2 ways of doing this. You either make the heroine very sympathetic, like Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, where she volunteers on behalf of her little sister because she knows her little sister doesn't stand a chance in the Hunger Games, whereas she probably thinks, well, I'll do this for her. You can have a pat the dog moment. Lots of guides on writing will talk about pat the dog. It's where the heroine does something nice for somebody else without having an ulterior motive for it. She just does something nice, which is called pat the dog, where if they go past the dog, they give it a bit of a pat and a smooch. And it shows that they're a nice human being, perhaps, because if they kick the dog, then you know that they're the bad guy. Another way to make the reader care is to make the heroine so compelling that you can't look away, like Scarlett O'Hara. She's a bit of a train wreck at times. You can't look away. Hey, that movie with Amy Schumer at the moment, Trainwreck, same thing. You cannot look away. Make them a force of nature or a force of will. Now, card number 3. Card number 3 is the call to adventure or the plot catalyst. Without this, there is no story. So you need this. Otherwise, you have no story. This is active. This is where the heroine might at first refuse the call and then she will accept the call. Sometimes that happens over several scenes. Sometimes it happens within a breath. If you've seen the film The Dark Crystal, there's a moment where Jen, the gelfling, starts walking off on his journey and he says to himself, I can't do this alone. And then he shakes himself a little bit and says, okay, alone then. That's it. Here we come to stasis equals death. I told you I'd get to this. This is a moment where your character has to realise that if she stays like she is, she might be protecting herself, but she's going to shrivel up inside. Now, the death could be literal death, or it can be figurative. So there's a few different ways that you can die. You can die because you'll never love again. That's an emotional death. You can die a career death. Your ambitions can all fall to bits. That's a professional death. Or you can lose yourself, and that can be the death of your identity, of who you are, which is really psychological, and I love that. So not necessarily the literal stasis equals death, which you'll see in a James Bond film, but a lot of romances are about a psychological death and an emotional death. So keep that in mind. Now, as we move on to card 4, this is an active card again. This card is called State the Plan. I cannot emphasize this enough. You need to state the plan. As the writer, you might know where it's going, but the reader doesn't. So what you do here, over the space of several scenes, is you have your heroine stating what she wants out of life. She needs to state the plan. She needs to decide, this is what I'm going to do. Now, in a romance, it might be that she's decided, I'm never going to fall for the bad boy again, but that doesn't mean I can't have a fling. That kind of thing. That can be her plan. You don't need to state every step of the way of how she's going to get there. You just need to state that goal. So you can call this state the goal if you want. This is where your heroine's going to come into conflict with other people because you have conflicting goals. In some writing books about structure, this section will be called Gathering Allies. It's where you get all your team, start building your team and getting your team together. For a heist film, for example, this is where you start bringing all your experts in. So they are your allies. But in a romance, again, that might not necessarily fit your structure. So I've called it State the Plan or State the Goal. So State the Plan is your launch into Act 2. So we had the plot catalyst, which is the end of Act 1. So we launch into Act 2 with State the Plan. This is where we start to see some evidence. Don't just tell us, but show us ways that the heroine and the hero have conflicting goals. Or they might have similar goals, but have conflicting agendas where they've got different ways of going about it. Now, this is a very, very active section of your story. Everything is moving forward and it happens over multiple scenes. So in the State the Plan, there's no time to sit back and wonder about how things are going and reflect. Okay? Keep things moving forward. Keep us pushing into Act 2. Card number 5 is terrific because we've just had State the Plan. Now we've got further complications. This is where things don't go to plan. So it's active, but then a little bit reflective. Okay? But not too much. This is perhaps where your heroine will come up against her first few hurdles of where she thought she was going to get her own way and she doesn't. So further complications is a terrific thing. Things don't go to plan, and that's okay. So the further complications, we have a victory and then a setback. Or we have a victory and then a compromise of some sort. You need to keep the story moving forward, which means keep things active. You can bring in some backstory here about perhaps why the heroine wants what she wants and how she's come to this place. But not too much because don't bog it down. So be careful the way you're weaving it through. Card number 6 is fantastic. Card number 6 is very active. It's called The Promise of the Premise. This is the very heart of your book. Now, in Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, he talks about how a lot of movies have their promos made out of this section of the film. It's where there's a lot of fun and games. He calls it fun and games. And this is the promise of the premise. So the heart of your book, if you have a ghost and a ghostbuster, this is where you'll be ghosting and busting. If you have a rake and a debutante, this is where they shall be raking and debutanting. Okay? This is where they start that little dance around each other and start getting a little bit closer and closer. They start to realise perhaps they can work together. They can be doing what they're doing. So keep this one active and moving forward, and it's lots of fun. This is where you should be smiling while you're writing, okay? Not crying. Please don't cry during this part. So we are up to the midpoint already. We've only got 5 cards to go. As you can see, we've got our opening image, then we've got the next 2 parts of part 1, the disturbance and the plot catalyst. Then into launch into Act 2, we've got State the Plan, further complications, and the promise of the premise, which leads us towards our midpoint. So as you get towards the end of that section called Promise of the Premise, where you've got the bit of fun and games happening, you start to lead towards that moment of defeat, where things are pretty tough in the midpoint, where your heroine needs to make her mission statement about how she's going to go forward from here. She can't go back, she has to go forward. So let's go forward. We're moving into card 8. This is the second half of Act 2. This is very active. Now, Blake Snyder calls this bad guys close in. I've got lots of other things to call it because in a movie, you will have the literal bad guys closing in. You might have a car chase. You might have whoever it is, the external conflict coming in and messing up your hero or your heroine's life. That doesn't necessarily happen with a romance because it's the internal conflict that is keeping them apart. So here's what works for me. Okay, if bad guys doesn't work, bad guys close in doesn't work, call it self-sabotage. Call it I'm my own worst enemy. Call it internal conflict pushes them further apart. And if all else fails, You can call it, this is why we can't have nice things. Okay? So, it's the launch into the second half of Act 2. It's where the deeply held beliefs keep the hero and the heroine apart, so their internal conflicts are keeping them apart. It helps to ramp up the conflict. It's a step up from further complications, which was card 5. So those further complications on card 5 start to play out now, which is fantastic. It happens over multiple scenes. It's not just a single scene. There are lots of scenes happening around here. And just keep in mind, if nothing else works for you, call it, this is why we can't have nice things. On to card number 9. This one's called the ticking clock, and it's active. The ticking clock is a fantastic device for making things hurry up. The reason you need things to hurry up is because you need an impetus to get things done. I struggled for a while with one of my books, 1916ish. I had things happening, they're in the same order, but there wasn't that haste, that burning need to get things done by a certain point, until I came up with a reason why my 3 heroes had to be on that train in the morning. That was it, they had to be on that. They were going to get on it anyway, but now there's a pressing need for them to get on it. So the ticking clock is where something must be done by a set deadline. It needs to be a tight or impossible time frame, because that really pushes things along. If they don't make that deadline, the worst thing possible will happen. And of course, you know you're going to make the worst thing happen anyway, but your hero and your heroine are going to try not to make it happen. And as an example, if you think about Gone with the Wind, this is the moment in the movie and in the book where Scarlett needs $300 to pay the taxes on Tara. Now, she's got no money at all. If she doesn't get that $300, the Yankees are going to sell up Tara, so everyone will be kicked out of home. And so what does she do? She puts on that curtain dress, the dress made of curtains, and she goes off to see Rhett Butler to try and borrow money from him. All of which then leads into card number 10, which is the black moment. So they've done as much as they possibly can to get to that, get through the ticking clock section, and it's still going to blow up in their faces, okay? So this is the black moment, which is a phrase that's very familiar to a lot of romance writers and readers. It's very reflective, okay? So here's where your heroine can truly wallow in self-pity, okay? The black moment, The black moment is where all is lost, love is not enough, everything has turned to crap, okay? They are in a very, very deep hole, and this brings us to the end of Act 2, okay? So the next thing is in the next part of this webinar, and further reading, again, these are the same 4 books that I recommended at the end of the last one, because they are just absolutely wonderful. Now, I especially recommend reading The Virgin's Promise by Kim Hudson, because that is a different way of looking at structure, and it's from a specifically romance-friendly, female agency way of writing, and it is absolutely superb, and it's a brilliant way of looking at storytelling. And I will see you in part 3.